Wandering in. For those of you that are already comfortably settled, get your clicking devices ready, sign into your Clicker account if you can, because we will be clicking a lot today. Welcome to the second and last lecture of Cycle 1. After today, I'll have my office hours tomorrow, but then next week you will have Professor Nikki teaching you for the next several weeks. And you'll see me again after Thanksgiving sometime for the rest of the course. So the previous lecture, the HIV lecture that we just had was, as I think everyone gathered, it wasn't really a lecture about the specific points of viruses. It was more an introduction to natural selection and to evolution. And today's lecture is a more formal introduction to evolution. What do we mean when we talk about evolutionary theory? Even bigger picture, what do we mean when we talk about scientific theories in general? And we'll be doing a lot of clicking today, if the clickers work, which they didn't yesterday. The title of today's lecture, Why Evolution is True, is not a cool phrase that I came up with myself. It's a rip-off, or I like to think, an homage to this brilliant book by Jerry Coyne. On the left, you can see the first ever depiction of what we call a phylogenetic tree. This is a little doodle, a sketch that was done by Charles Darwin, taken from one of his notebooks as he was starting to develop his big idea, which included the sort of revolutionary idea that everything on Earth was related to everything else. So, for those of you who are not in a Wi-Fi dead zone, if I asked you this question, what's your opinion? Are humans probably the product of evolution or not? In other words, humans evolved from earlier species of animals. What do we think? Is that probably true? Do you think maybe that's not true? Do you have no idea, and that's why you signed up for this course? We can take a look at the viewpoints of this class, knowing, of course, that people who are science majors or biomedical science majors or health science majors at a big research-intensive university are perhaps not a perfectly random subset of the population. But let's see what you guys think. Okay, clickers are working great. Okay, so yeah, this is an opinion question, so I'm not going to say which is right or which is incorrect, but these opinions are very much in line with your colleagues in yesterday's section, in the Wednesday section of the class. The overwhelming majority of people here think that there is good reason to be confident in the idea that humans have an evolutionary history and that we are presumably related to other forms of life on Earth. So, awesome. The same question has been put to people all over the world. And so about 20 years, Angus Reid, pollster company, presented this question to citizens of 35 developed nations, and the proportion of people sort of endorsing the idea that the humans, like other things, have an evolutionary history, that we are products of evolution. The proportion or buy-in to that idea is shown here in blue. And so the font is tiny, and you don't have to remember any of this, but it's just notable that Iceland is sort of the top of the pack for acceptance of evolution, with maybe 85% of the population agreeing with that idea. The Scandinavian countries in general have very high support for evolution. It's lower in other parts of the developed world. We've got Turkey at the very bottom of this particular poll, with about 25% of people thinking that's probably true, and about half the people thinking it's probably false. So Turkey's at the bottom. Second lowest acceptance of evolution was in the United States. which is kind of sobering. It's about 40% thinking that humans probably did evolve from earlier species of animals, 40% thinking that humans probably didn't evolve from early species of animals. That is, the idea that humans instead were created pretty much in our present form by some supernatural entity, maybe very recently, maybe within the last 5,000 years or so, and about 20% not sure. Now, for a long time, when I would teach this lecture, I would show this slide, and people would say, what about people in Canada? And I would have to say, we don't know because they didn't ask us. They didn't do the poll in Canada. But now, fortunately, a Canadian polling group sponsored by the National Centre for Science Education has asked this question to Canadian citizens. And the proportion of people sort of accept it, or thinking that evolution is probably true is around 64%, whereas support for what we might call young Earth creationism is hovering around 21%. And there's a lot of people that just don't know one way or the other. I will say also that these figures are not completely homogeneous across the whole country. They vary with age. There's more support for evolutionary theory in younger demographics than in baby boomers and older. And it varies with political affiliation as well. But that's sort of where the country is at as of last year, which are the most recent data I have. And there's always been, ever since 1859, when Darwin published The Origin of Species, evolution has always been fairly controversial as scientific theories go. Not controversial among scientists. There's overwhelming support that, there's awesome evidence for evolution among the scientific community, but just among the general community, it's particularly polarizing in a way that, like, gravitational theory or even the germ theory of disease or string theory is not. And so when we think about, what was even in Darwin's theory, what are the most important aspects of evolutionary theory? Why do people get so upset about this and say that it shouldn't be taught in public schools, or that if we teach evolution in high school biology classes, we need to give equal time to creationism in a science class? So when we think about, what are the important parts of Darwin's theory, we'll go over these in a minute, but most people would say, okay, Darwin, he's famous for natural selection, right? And that's true, but natural selection is not the most controversial aspect of Darwin's theory. Instead, now, just like it was in 1859, the thing that really got people riled up was the idea that humans were not specifically and specially created by some supernatural God. The idea that humans are just one of millions of other species on Earth, that we have an evolutionary history, and that we are related to every other form of life on the planet. So it's this idea that humans specifically have descended from other earlier forms of animals and earlier species. These ideas are in conflict, or seem to be in conflict, with at least some religious traditions, some creation stories, and some belief systems. There are many religions that have no issue at all, no problem with evolutionary biology, but there are some famously that do. So what do I even mean when I talk about a belief system? First of all, we all have belief systems, whether or not we consider ourselves to be religious at all. But everybody, I would say, just about everybody, has some set of principles, and you might describe that as your moral code or your personal philosophy, or maybe it's your religious traditions that you were brought up in. Anyway, it's a set of beliefs, a set of convictions or things that you just accept on faith. So maybe you, hopefully, most people here, one of your beliefs might include that everybody is entitled to a certain set of human rights, that there are some universal human rights, and everybody has the right to this, and everybody has the right to this. Maybe, hopefully, most of you would subscribe to the belief that murder is wrong. Anyway, ideas like this are not really intended to be tested scientifically. You don't go out and what if I just violate this group's human rights? Or what if I just murder this person? Is that still? No, it's not something that you are intended to test. It's something that you just take on faith. Belief systems don't change based on testing or evidence. This is in contrast to scientific theories. And when we talk about theories in common parlance, like if you're down at the club and you're just talking to your friends, you might say, I have a theory that my roommate is hitting on my boyfriend. Or I have a theory that this is happening. And you may not have any evidence to support it. It's just some half-baked idea. We often use the term theory like that in common parlance. But the technical definition of a scientific theory is that, no, a theory is more than that. It's a coherent set of hypotheses or ideas about the natural world. And these ideas have to be testable in order to be a scientific theory. So we might have theories about, how gravity works, or I don't know, theories about how atoms work, or how electrons interact with other things. Anyway, to be considered a scientific theory, an idea or a hypothesis or a statement, there has to be some way that you can test it, because that is how the scientific process works. We come up with a theory or a hypothesis, and we attempt to test it. And not only does it have to be testable, but it also, in order to be scientific, has to be falsifiable. Falsifiable does not mean the same as being false. Falsifiable means that if a hypothesis is wrong, there is some real or hypothetical observation or experimental outcome that would show us that it's wrong. So an example of a falsifiable statement might be a bear is going to run through the classroom at 10 o'clock today. That is, it's testable. We can just sit here and see if that happens. Let's hope it doesn't. It is a falsifiable statement because at 10 o'clock, if that does not happen, then we say, oh, that statement was wrong. So there's a hypothetical outcome that would show that statement to be false. And this is really key to scientific theories. We come up with a scientific hypothesis or an idea, we test it, we wait and see if a bear comes through the room, or maybe you set up an experiment if your hypothesis is about something else, and you try to falsify that hypothesis. And if you do falsify the hypothesis, if that bear does not come running through the room, then we just throw it out, or we modify the hypothesis, change it. Oops. Yeah, okay. So the key point of the scientific method is that scientific theories, unlike your personal belief systems, change with the evidence. You don't keep on just doing the same thing and hoping that the evidence will change. No, you have to change your hypotheses to be consistent with what you actually find, which is different from belief systems. Okay, so, all right. Probably no one in this class except for me was even born yet when the Dover trial happened in Pennsylvania, but this is sort of a famous trial that took place, and it happened because the school board tried to mandate that in high school biology classes, if the biology teacher wanted to teach about evolution, they had to devote equal time to teaching about young Earth creationism. Evolution is just a theory, and here's another theory about how humans got to be here. Parents didn't like that, and they took the school board to court, and the judge agreed with the parents and said, no, intelligent design, which is a form of young Earth creationism, intelligent design does not belong in science classes. So the clicker question is why? Why not? What is... What's the issue? What's the problem with giving equal airtime to, say, a belief system, which a lot of people subscribe to? Awesome. Okay, yeah, so the most popular answer here is B. There we go. Good job. Good job if you recognize that the issue with intelligent design is that it is not scientific. So it hasn't actually, yeah, I would say young Earth creationism has not actually been falsified. That is, we've never shown it to be false. That's not the problem. The problem is that we can never show it to be false because it is not falsifiable. Anytime you are appealing to a supernatural being that is capable of turning themselves invisible or hiding all of the evidence that they've ever existed, yeah, you can't falsify that with scientific methods. So the problem with intelligent design, why it doesn't belong in a science class, is because it's not science. So yeah, so Judge Jones ruled that intelligent design shouldn't be taught in science classes because it is not science. Okay, so in order to be considered a scientific theory or a scientific hypothesis or a scientific idea or a scientific statement, there's got to be a way of testing it, and there's got to be some either real or hypothetical observation that could falsify it. If the idea is wrong, there's got to be a way of learning that it's wrong. Some possible experimental outcome that could prove that it's false, if it is false. So here's a statement that I probably said something like this in the last lecture, that if a human is infected with HIV and they take the drug AZT, I said, well, we can predict that AZT-resistant forms of HIV are going to increase in frequency in that patient's body. Whereas we wouldn't see that happening if the patient doesn't take AZT. So is there some sort of hypothetical observation that could falsify this? Yeah. Right, yeah. So if a patient takes AZT but the population of virions in their body doesn't change, the resistance doesn't increase, then that has falsified that statement. So this would be a falsifiable set of statements. Whereas if I told you positive thinking can cure cancer, you just have to try hard enough. Is that a falsifiable statement? Yes. Very good. Yeah, maybe I try really hard to cure or a cancer patient attempts really hard to think positively and their cancer doesn't go into remission. But yeah, you can always say, you just weren't trying hard enough. You just need to do a little bit better. So squishy statements like these are often not falsifiable. Awesome. Okay, last thing before I retire the discussion of falsifiability, because it is really important. This is just a fun way of recognizing that even statements that have nothing to do with science can be classified as to whether or not they are falsifiable. So Maybe nobody knows any of these songs anymore, unless you've been rickrolled in the last little while. But these are all really great songs. You should put them all in your playlist, but not all of these song titles make falsifiable statements. So often on the midterm or the final exam, there will be a question about, can you recognize a falsifiable statement? That is there some possible finding that would prove one of these statements to be false? Okay. All right. Oh, you guys, okay, this is awesome. Okay, yeah, D is the correct answer. Sweet. Okay, but we can go through these and understand. So why is A falsifiable? What could happen that would falsify Rick Astley's statement in A? Yes. Yeah. If Rick Astley gives you up, then A is falsified. Okay, so that A is a falsifiable statement. Nice. What about B? I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor. Yeah, what would happen? Yeah, if you don't survive, then there, your statement's falsified. Bang. Okay, You Can't Touch This by MC Hammer. What would have to happen to falsify this statement? Yeah? You touch this. Very good. Okay. Rhythm Is Gonna Get You by Gloria Estefan and Miami Sound Machine. Okay, maybe the rhythm hasn't gotten me yet. Does that falsify the statement? No, because maybe I just have to wait longer. Maybe the rhythm is going to get me, but it just hasn't gotten me yet, and I just have to bide my time and be patient. Okay, so D is not a falsifiable statement, whereas these others I would say are. Okay, nice. Okay, so that's scientific theories. In general, they got to be testable and they have to be falsifiable. There has to be some possible observation that would prove it to be wrong if indeed it is wrong. Falsifiable is not necessarily the same as being false. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about Darwin's theory or the theory of evolution? Oh yeah, question.
It wasn't specific enough because does that look like in your entire, like, it won't get you if you die, like, wouldn't it be called falsifiable?
Okay, yeah, I guess you could make, yeah, if she had written a different song title, you're right, the rhythm is going to get you before you die, or the rhythm is going to get you by Friday or something, then yeah, that would be more falsifiable had she been more specific. Very good. Okay, so, but anyway, moving on. What do we mean when we talk about evolutionary theory? Evolution is a huge theory. It's a very complex theory with lots of distinct but sort of interrelated parts. And so I'll go over what are the main principles of evolutionary theory. And most of these we will dive into in more detail later in the course. But when Darwin talked about evolution, he specifically called it descent with modification from a common ancestor. Unpack that. So descent with modification. So underline the modification there. Maybe the lowest hanging fruit. Okay, what does the theory of evolution involve? Oh, I know. It involves evolution. It involves change. So one important aspect of evolutionary theory is that populations evolve. So allele frequencies change in a population over evolutionary time, that is from one generation to the next. And phenotypes, phenotypic frequencies in the population change from one generation to the next. And sometimes this can happen over hundreds of thousands of years. Like there's been evolution in the skull shape and size of our own species, as shown on the left in the fossil record. Sometimes it can happen over much faster time frames. So you probably all heard or read about the example of the peppered moth in in England and other parts of Europe before the Industrial Revolution, most of the pepper moths were pale, like the little dude on the bottom, and that presumably allowed them to be very well hidden against tree trunks back in the days before tree trunks were all covered with soot. But then later, thanks to air pollution, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, the tree trunks became much darker in color, and most of the peppered moths, after several generations, ended up having this dark or melanistic, but just dark form and coloration. So that happened relatively recently. Didn't take hundreds of thousands of years to happen. And we've seen, of course, in the evolution of HIV, the evolution of drug resistance, that can happen faster still. It can happen within a few months. Okay. So evolution happens. This is obviously a tenet of evolutionary theory. Another big idea, which, as I've said, got sort of polite Victorian society all infuriated, is the idea of common ancestry. So descent with modification from a common ancestor. So one of the really radical aspects of evolutionary theory when Darwin proposed it is that everything is related to everything else. And if we could trace our ancestry back, eventually all life, even things like bacteria and funguses, as well as animals, are related to each other through descent from a single common ancestor. We call that the last universal common ancestor, and we'll be talking more about that creature later in the course. So yeah, there are some, everything is related to everything else. We have some relatively close evolutionary relatives like gorillas and chimpanzees. We have some much more distant evolutionary relatives like cabbages and oak trees and beetles and bacteria, but everything is related to everything else if you just trace its ancestry back far enough. Now, the flip side of the idea of common ancestry is the idea of speciation, and this is another huge area of current research in evolutionary biology. In other words, how do we get from this situation, say 4 billion years ago or so, when there was only one type of organism in the world, and now there's like tens of millions of species, at least, maybe more than that. How do we go from one to many, many, many species? It's through a process of speciation. So it's branching events when you look at a phylogeny or at a tree of life. Each one of those branching events represents a speciation event. So one lineage or the evolution of one population splits up into two or more reproductively isolated daughter groups. And so this cartoon here just shows speciation that is sort of in the process of happening in this group of salamanders that sort of surround the Central Valley in California. They all, within probably about 1 million years ago, they all belonged to the same species, but now they are becoming isolated from each other. And you can see they're starting to look different. They may not be interested in mating with salamanders from the other groups. Speciation is happening. Okay, another really important part of evolutionary theory, and this is something that separates Darwin from other fans of evolution who were his contemporaries, like Lamarck. Maybe you read about Lamarck's theory in the assigned readings. I can't remember if the textbook talks about Lamarck or not. I think it does. One of Darwin's major insights was that evolution is a variational process. It is not a transformational process. In other words, evolution doesn't proceed by an individual changing its phenotype during its lifetime and then passing those changes off onto its offspring. Instead, evolution requires that there's variation in the population, and then some variants are just more successful, more likely to survive, more likely to have a lot of babies than other variants are. So, does anyone still play Pokemon? Is that still a thing? Am I one person? Okay, 2 people do, 3. Okay, good. Okay, so if you play Pokemon and you have a Munchlax, okay, you have a Munchlax and then you feed it and it evolves into a Snorlax. In Pokemon, that's evolution. But in science and in biology, we would say, no, that is development, when an individual like just sort of levels up in his lifetime and becomes like more tough. That's not evolution. In biology, we reserve the term evolution for change that happens across generation, from one generation to the next. So please don't think about individuals evolving within their lifetime. No, populations evolve from one generation to the next as allele frequencies change, and because of that, phenotype frequencies change. Oh, Drake is problematic these days. Okay, I got next year I'm changing out this meme, but this is just to remind me and you that in this class we mostly don't subscribe to this transformational view of evolution. Lamarck actually thought that individuals could change their phenotype to become better suited to the environment, and then those acquired changes could be transmitted to the next generation. That's sort of like a Lamarckian view of evolution. For the most part now, we recognize that instead evolution acts on variation. It doesn't require that individuals change their phenotype during their lifetime. Instead, populations evolve, individuals don't evolve. Sorry about the Drake. Okay, so just to go over that in a little more rigor, then on the top we have an idea of evolution that Lamarck would have subscribed to. This is the transformational view of evolution. Again, we don't think that this is the way it works, but a transformational, somebody subscribing to the transformational view would say, okay, how do we get from a population that's mostly white and round to a population that is mostly darker and stretched out? Well, it happens because each individual, so says the transformational evolutionary biologist, each individual stretches themselves out to become better suited to the environment as they go from being a baby to being a reproductive adult, and then they transmit that change in phenotype to the next generation. And then the next generation of babies likewise gets darker and more stretched out, and so on. And that's how we move to this population where it's more dark and more stretched out. But you could just like take a pencil and scratch that out, put a big X through it. We don't think that evolution works that way, not anymore. Instead, we know, and you remember from the last class, that evolution requires that there is variation in the population. Not everybody has the same phenotype. So the starting population, yeah, there's some individuals that are kind of round little blobs, but there's other ones that are dark and stretched out. And then, and so some of them will make it to reproductive age and some of them won't, and maybe there's an advantage to being dark and stretched out, and so these individuals are more likely to survive to reproduction. They are more likely to produce many babies instead of dying or producing just a few babies. And so because of that process, because natural selection is operating on this variation, in this bottom panel, we move from a population that's more round and light on average to a population that is darker and stretched out on average. Evolution requires variation. Okay, another important aspect of evolutionary thought is the idea of gradualism. So evolutionary change takes time. And massive, big evolutionary changes take a lot of time, or specifically many generations. Some things have faster generation times than others, but we wouldn't move from like a theropod dinosaur here to a modern day bird in just like 2 or 3 or 4 generations. This would presumably take thousands, maybe millions of generations to get these big changes in phenotype. So that's the idea of gradualism. And a corollary of that is the idea of transitional forms. Sometimes we call these missing links. It's the idea that if we're lucky, there's going to be some evidence of this transition from this type of dinosaur 150 million years ago to modern day birds. In the fossil record, maybe if we're lucky, we'll find something like an Archaeopteryx that has feathers and but also teeth, some bird-like traits, some dinosaur-like traits. So sometimes we can find evidence of these transitions in the fossil record. So that's gradualism and transitional forms. Okay, another huge aspect of evolution obviously is Darwin was the first to hit upon how selection works, how natural as well as sexual selection works. Now, selection is a huge cause of evolution. Selection can cause a population to become better fit to its environment. So a population of HIV virus becomes resistant to AZT if we treat it with AZT, or a population of polar bears becomes very well camouflaged thanks to their white fur, camouflaged to a snowy environment. So selection, and we call this adaptation, when selection makes a population better suited to a particular environment. Selection is the only thing that can cause adaptation, that can make a population better fit to its environment. But selection is not the only possible cause of evolution. So a lot of evolution is due to selection. Do you guys think of anything else that might cause, say, allele frequencies to change in a population? Yeah. Sorry? Humans? Okay, yeah. I mean, humans can apply selection to other populations. I guess technologically we can introduce new mutations. Yeah. Environmental changes. Environmental changes can change the direction of selection. So I'm thinking of something else. Maybe one more.
Maybe like diseases or food limitations.
Diseases, food limitations. Yeah, all of these could change could change populations, but they could be associated with selection. Anyone is thinking of something, an evolutionary process that starts with maybe the letter D? Yell it out. De-evolution. Okay, drift, genetic drift is what we'll get to genetic drift later in the class. All to say that there are just other things. Selection is not the only cause of evolution. Selection is the only cause of adaptation, but not all evolution is adaptive. Some evolution is just like neutral, or even perhaps harmful to a population. Okay. Excellent. I want to go over now, just real quickly, a few common misconceptions about evolutionary theory. Evolution is one of these theories that most people think they understand very well, even most people that have never taken a biology class. Yeah, question?
Are there also other ones, like other than genetic differences, like sexual selection, variability, or
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so what about sexual selection? Can that cause populations to evolve? Absolutely, it can, yeah. Sometimes we fold in sexual selection and natural selection and just say selection. You know, they're both ways that the population can become better fit to the environment. Gene flow is another thing that can cause populations to change. If there's a lot of migration from one continent to another, then the allele frequencies are probably going to change. We'll talk about all of these probably in cycle 6. So, yeah. Okay. But lots of people think that they understand evolution, but there is still a lot of sort of misinformation, fake news about evolution still out there. So sometimes people will say, well, I don't know about evolutionary theory, because if we're descended from chimpanzees, why are there still chimpanzees around? Why can I still go visit the chimpanzees in the zoo? So this idea that humans are descended from chimpanzees True or false? False, right. Humans are related to chimpanzees. That is not the same as being descended from chimpanzees. It's like you are related to your brother or your sister if you have one, but you're not descended from them. You are related to your cousins if you have cousins, but you are not descended from your cousins. You have some ancestors in common. We are all evolutionary cousins of each other. Okay, this is a really still pervasive one. The idea that we can sort of rank species on a hierarchy. In the textbook, they call it the scale of nature. And some things are more highly evolved than others, and there's higher life forms and there's lower life forms. And we of course, as humans, are at the top, according to this idea. This is also wrong. It turns out to be wrong, and Darwin showed that this is wrong because of the fact of common ancestry. Everything on Earth is evolving from the same universal common ancestor. Everything on Earth has been evolving and changing and diverging from that last universal common ancestor for the same amount of evolutionary time. So all species that are currently alive on the planet, we all have the same length of evolutionary history. I would say then it doesn't make sense to say that there's some are more highly evolved and others are less highly evolved. Again, evolution is not like a ladder, it's more like a really branching bush. Yeah, question? We probably won't talk about Wallace in this class. Yeah, good question. Wallace also sort of independently came up with the idea of how natural selection and sexual selection works. But no, Darwin's mostly our guy with a few shout outs to Lamarck. Yeah, question in the purple?
Yes. So you said that all species are the same length of what about like horseshoe crabs?
Okay, yeah. So horseshoe crabs have gone through long periods of time where they haven't evolved much. Not that we can tell in their fossil record, anyway. And this, yeah, that's a great point. I would say that they have been evolving for the same length of time, but things that have occupied a very stable environment maybe won't have undergone the same changes in phenotype. But I think that's not the same as being less highly evolved or being lower somehow. Good question. Okay, here's another wrong statement. Mutations are directed towards the needs of the organism. No, mutations are random. Thank you very much. Okay, mutations are random. Now, the fate of the mutation is going to depend on the selective environment, but mutations themselves are just random mistakes. Glad everyone knows that. And also, people often have this idea that selection is a source of perfection, that selection makes organisms perfectly suited to their environment. That's not true. Adaptation is pretty powerful and pretty cool, and selection does make organisms better suited to their environment, but it's not perfect for a couple reasons. Probably the biggest reason these days is that the environment is often changing much faster than evolution can compensate for that. And so there's a lot of species now in an age of climate change, for example, that are adapted to environmental conditions and time, what time the trees leaf out in the spring and so forth, and temperature regimes that were common like 1,000 years ago. But now that if the environment is changing too rapidly, then selection is not necessarily going to be able to keep up with rapid paces of environmental change. There's other reasons too, though. There can be like what we call trade-offs. So it might be nice to have, I don't know, like strong. If we as humans had like stronger bones than we do, then would never break a bone, even if you were like doing crazy things on your bike and fell off. But that comes with a cost. So the cost of having really big bones would be, I don't know, like you'd be so heavy that you would require like a lot more food. Or maybe it would be nice if humans were even smarter than we are. Like our brains are pretty big and pretty powerful, but what if our brains were like 4 times the size and you could just like show up in this class and not even have to do the reading and understand everything anyway? Yeah, that would be sweet. But you know, to have a brain that was like this big instead of this big, maybe female humans would have to have hips that were like this big, and so it would be very difficult to walk. And so there's costs as well as benefits of certain traits. For these reasons, organisms are not usually perfectly fit to their environment. Oh yeah, all evolution is due to selection. No, genetic drift, gene flow, and other things can also cause evolution. We'll be talking more about that later in the course. Okay, I think I want to go through a few of these. Yeah, okay. So, yeah, just a few really quick clicker questions. So for an observation like this, Archaeopteryx has features that are characteristic of birds, but also characteristics of some dinosaurs that we call theropods that are extinct now. Often on the midterm, I will give you like some observation like this and say, which of these aspects of evolutionary theory does this tell us about? So see what you think. Maybe the clickers have stopped working. Oh, well. Okay, so not every observation about the natural world is informative about every single aspect of evolution, but raise your hand if you think that finding something like Archaeopteryx in the fossil record tells us mostly about speciation. Maybe a little bit. Raise your hand if you think it tells us more about B, about the idea that evolution is variational, not transformational. Yeah, that's not very popular either. Raise your hand if you think it tells us mostly about natural selection. Does this change our understanding about how selection works? A little bit. Raise your hand if you think this is most relevant to the idea of gradualism. Yes, I would agree. I know my internet connection is down. Stop it. Okay. Okay. I'll go through another one, and then I made way too many of these clicker questions. I'll just post them as practice questions after the lecture, because we won't go through them all. Okay, here's another fun fact. Adult dolphins have flippers, but they don't have hind limbs. However, when they are developing as baby dolphins, baby embryo dolphins, the baby dolphins actually do sprout hind limbs, and then those hind limbs go whoop, they just eat them back into themselves, they resorb them. So what is this? What aspect of evolutionary theory is this most informative of? Does this tell us anything about common ancestry? Yes, absolutely it does. Probably the reason that they are growing and then ungrowing these hind limbs is because they are descended from an ancestral species that did actually have hind limbs. Good. There's lots more of these clicker questions, which I will post online. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Life continues to evolve.